Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Debaters Council's motion debriefs. Today we'll be talking about the prep motion recently set at the tournament organized by St. Joseph's College. The motion reads, this supports the shift of scientific journals towards the registered reports model. There's an Infoslide that says the registered reports model has researchers submit detailed protocols for peer review before any experiments are conducted. The methods, hypothesis, and background are peer reviewed prior to data collection. If the article is accepted, the journal guarantees the publication of the article, irrespective of the significance of results. I'll be attaching Elsie's prep case to this video. So if I am skipping mechanization or you're unclear about how to mechanize a certain claim, I'd say check the document. That should probably have more detail. But in terms of the case, before we get into like proposition, I think I generally note two things. The first is this is a prep motion, which means that because you and your team have spent some time researching this, you might have a conceptualization of the round and the concepts in the round that is significantly more advanced than the general judges. Like generally speaking, most judges do not research the prep motion themselves, which means that the understanding of the terms that you're referring to, it's probably going to be like much less advanced than your understanding of these might be as well. So do not skip the very necessary steps of explaining in as simple language as possible, whatever you are suggesting or arguing. And I think the biggest concern that occurs out of teams not doing this is that your argument might be logically true, but judges might not understand this. And even if they do, they can't apply their expert knowledge. If an average reasonable voter might not understand this. So you want to make sure that your cases are understandable, I think is the first general comment. The second general comment, I think, is given that this is a prep motion, what this affords you the luxury of is lots and lots of time to discuss and evaluate like the strategic end goals and how much strategic value you can extract out of each of the arguments you're making in each case. So what I mean by this is that there are some arguments that are probably going to be like the hill you need to die on, i.e. your case cannot win the round if you do not win or prove this argument. Whereas there are other arguments that like maybe you use to mitigate the margin in the clash that the other side is winning. Maybe it's an argument that like you say, and if the other side doesn't respond, you wait quite significantly. But if they do engage with it, you might not spend the entire rest of your responsive speeches engaging with that clash alone. Like it is a valid, legitimate strategy sometimes to drop arguments if the engagement out of the other side occurs, and then you don't have a way to like establish a conclusive, clear margin. So I think you want to spend a lot of time meditating on what those decisions might look like ahead of the round, because that might help you make decisions quicker on the fly. Obviously, you want to prepare for like a range of possibilities that might occur when it comes to these arguments and how they interact with the other side's case. So prepare for that as well, and we'll chat a bit about that once we get into the case. I'll be a lot more thorough, I think, with setup than I am with the actual arguments. But on proposition, this roughly looks like three things. I think the first thing you want to do is establish what the status quo of research looks like, i.e., researchers conduct experiments that they plan themselves without peer review. They collect data, then examine whether this data hypothesis proves a hypothesis that they formulated earlier. They then submit the paper to be peer reviewed and is published in journals. Peer reviewers have no control over the hypothesis or the experimental design and can only approve or reject papers that are submitted after completion. The next thing you want to say is you support a shift towards a different model. Scientists would plan an experiment and submit the procedure and the hypothesis for approval prior to data collection. If approved by the reviewers, the scientist then collects the data and gets the study published, regardless of whether the data proves or disproves the original hypothesis. The last this piece of setup, I think, serves like a very strong gatekeeping function, i.e., generally speaking, there is much less capacity to deviate from the experimental design in your world, and a guarantee of publication exists. But beyond these two characteristics, you don't need to support or marry your case to a very specific model. Like you can support a general shift, which means that industry-specific journals can design conditions specific to their speciality and their field of research. So illustrations of what this might look like are some journals might allow researchers to deviate from their original design that was approved if they flag the deviation clearly with strong justification as to why that was the only option. Maybe some journals might accept experimental design trees, where if one researcher succeeds at one task, the experimental design might follow one path, but if the researcher fails at the initial task, maybe they do something else instead because that's the best way to conduct the experiment, and maybe that can be approved by the peer reviewers. Obviously, you can say that these illustrations aren't exhaustive, but the point is that flexibility can exist between industries. And you gatekeep against an opposition argument about too much rigidity being a bad thing in scientific experiments. In terms of arguments, I think you can make three. First, about reducing questionable research practices in the scientific industry. Second, about improving the efficacy of research conducted. Third, and finally, about why you're better for younger researchers. I think in terms of the argument about reducing questionable research practices, I think the primary things you want to establish within the argument is that there is an incredible amount of pressure on researchers and academics to get their research published because there's a lot of competition in the industry, because the industry uses like publication metrics, like how many papers they published, how much it has been cited by other academics as a way to evaluate the quality of academics in terms of hiring them and giving them tenure, which obviously means like the difference between financial stability or having to apply for jobs all over again for an academic, which means that there's massive pressure to create published work. The next thing you prove is that the current model of research, coupled with this massive pressure to publish, creates very bad incentives that that are not sufficiently addressed right now. So what I mean by this is that academic fraud increases because massive pressure means that researchers might create fraudulent data in order to get good hypotheses and prove things, which makes it more likely that your papers are published. This also increases the likelihood that researchers change their hypothesis after data collection to try and gather data to try and come up with a hypothesis that matches the data that they collected instead of saying that the research proved that the initial original hypothesis was incorrect. I think you want to establish why all of this is likely with analysis as to why journals themselves have strong reasons and incentives to publish only successful research in the status quo when the journals receive only completed research. And once you do that, you want to establish why all of these things are harmful. So academic fraud obviously is harmful because literally fraudulent data leads you to conclusions that are not empirically true. But even for changing hypotheses after data collection, you can establish this to be harmful because you can say that researchers who change the hypothesis after might not actually know everything about their new hypothesis because the experiment wasn't designed to find out everything about it, which means that they might be engaging in finding a correlation that does not exist, or maybe they just like don't know everything that should be published, which then leads other researchers astray, for example. So I think you establish these harms and then you say that the registered reports model is much better at solving all of this because there's a guarantee of publication, which then means that the incentive to do all of these kinds of questionable research practices goes away to a very large extent. And the final thing you prove in the argument is that all of this matters because academic research, while it might sound boring and like not important to average people's lives, it does really matter quite significantly. Like this is how pharmaceutical companies and regulators, for example, approve the drugs that we consume. You want to try and figure out other illustrations of how academic research has a significant impact on our lives and then go with that. In terms of the second argument about improving the efficacy of research conducted, I think you want to try and establish three different things. The first is that you reduce the duplication of the same study across the world, which is that current journals have a bias towards not publishing null findings, i.e. the experiments that disprove the original hypothesis. So as a result, if I have disproven a certain hypothesis in Sri Lanka, but no journal publishes this, another research team in Japan, for example, might think that the same hypothesis is promising, but they can't access my experiments data because it was never published in the first place, which means that they themselves might try to prove that hypothesis but fail, which means that scientific resources are being wasted instead of the knowledge being widely accessible in the community. Versus with registered reports, my failure is still published as a result of guaranteed publication. The second, I think, benefit you can establish is that you reduce financial waste because currently researchers have to come up with like experimental designs, go through a giant process to approve funding from their university or private grants, all the while knowing that they might not get it published in the first place, which means that universities, even if they give the money to a research, it might never get published and therefore the benefit to the community is low. Versus on your side, registered reports guarantee publication, which means that A, those studies get a lot more funding, but B, that money never goes to waste because these things are published for sure. The last thing I think you can establish is that you increase the kinds of experiments that become feasible for study. So longitudinal studies that take place like 20, 30 years at a time require huge amounts of funding, and you can get that easier if publication is guaranteed, or multivariate studies in which there are like hundreds of different phenomena or like variables, again, quite difficult to study and requires large amounts of funding. The guarantee of publication means that financing is much easier to come by. And all of this matters again, I think, because you want to establish like longitudinal and multivariate studies are quite important for advancing our research and understanding. Like if you want to understand the long-term effects of the consumption of Alzheimer drugs, you need to do a longitudinal study that's 20, 30 years down, because there's literally no other way that you can get access to this data, which is why guaranteeing financing and improving the efficacy of research conducted improves our knowledge and matters as well. Finally, in terms of the extension, I think you can establish that reducing inequality in academia is a good thing, because younger researchers are less likely to get priority funding when universities have no guarantee of their publication, and universities will instead give it to their like older, more proven academics. Versus in your world, when the registered reports anonymously approve the hypotheses that young researchers send across, the young researchers can use this as a leverage to demand funding from the universities. And you can establish that this is a good thing, good for their careers, good for the industry, because you retain young, talented people instead of not letting them drop out of academia. So I think these are the arguments you want to try and establish on proposition. In terms of the strategic value of all of these arguments, I think for the extension, this is like the argument you make. And if the other side doesn't respond, you can weigh this quite significantly. But if they do respond, I don't think there's a way for you to establish a giant margin with this. So you drop it if they respond successfully, I think. In terms of the arguments in the first speech, I think the first argument is probably the hill to die on proposition, because this is where you can make most guaranteed change. And this is, I think, where you can also establish and derive the most impact in the round as well. So maybe I would try to defend that argument as much as I can, which is why you want to build in as much comparative analysis as to why the registered reports model is better than status quo in the first speech itself. The second argument, while I think is promising for proposition as well, I do think like perhaps more easily contestable by opposition. So maybe I'd say I would focus on this slightly less than the first argument, which reflects the prioritization of the case as well. But strategically, I think the first and second are reasonably similar, and I could see a proposition winning the debate off of either one. I just think it's slightly easier to win off of the first argument than the second. Okay, on to opposition then. I think, again, setup includes like 3 or 4 things. The first thing you want to establish is that in the status quo, peer review is an incredibly rigorous process with 3 anonymous academics reviewing each paper and evaluating whether the scientific analysis is rigorous and reasonable for the data collected and whether the paper contributes novel ideas to scientific knowledge. I think you can say that while this might not be perfect, it's good enough to keep out the majority of fraud. The next thing you can establish is that there have been some issues with publication in the past, because any good proposition will have good examples of where academic fraud has occurred, for example. You want to try and avoid these harms. So you want to say that while things have gone wrong in the past, there has been improvements. Like a replication crisis has already been acknowledged in a range of different fields, which has created a push for methodologies that are easier to replicate and consequently easier to verify whether these findings and studies are actually true. Because if a study claims that something is true, you can redo the exact same study and presumably your data should reflect the original studies, which means you can verify the findings. The second thing you can say is that there's increasing scrutiny by universities and employers, because if their employees are engaging in fraud and they don't find it out and someone else does, it looks really bad on you as the employer, which is why Harvard in 2022, for example, fired 2 social psychologists for engaging in academic fraud. Finally, I think you can say that academics who have dedicated significant time to combating bad research have gained a lot of traction within the industry, which means that they're now in charge of journals and have the capacity to crack down on bad research from occurring in the first place. I think the last thing you want to establish and set up is that the word proposition supports is one in which every single paper needs to propose a strict methodology for conducting the experiment, submit it for peer review, and then begin the experiment after all of this while sticking uniformly to your pre-planned methodology. And while this might work for like some papers and industries, this might not and definitely does not work for all papers and all industries, which means that even if the system is well-intentioned, it will do more harm than good for the scientific establishment and research as a concept. So I think when it comes to the definitions here, clearly this opposition setup like contrasts quite heavily with the prop setup that we talked about. So I think if proposition runs the setup that we talked about that allows them to be relatively flexible, I would not make this the opposition hill to die on. I.e., if proposition agrees to the things that you point out, you obviously weaponize this against them. But if they have good setup or good responses about flexibility, you do not need this to win. And therefore, I would say strategically, it doesn't make much sense for you to spend most of your time on this. In terms of the arguments, three things again. First, about why registered reports worsen the process of research. Second, about why registered reports worsen the design of research. Finally, about why this is worse for younger researchers. First, about why registered reports worsen the process of research. I think the first thing you establish is that scientists who come across promising developments aren't able to pursue those developments when you have to pre-submit a hypothesis and the design. And this is bad because some of these new promising things that you found accidentally could be really, really helpful for humanity. And researchers might not be able to come back and do a whole other study about these new promising developments, which means that the only place for you to explore this is now within a research that you are already conducting, except proposition takes that flexibility away from you. The next thing you can say is that even if you're not changing the focus of the paper altogether to look at something more promising, maybe changing methodology might be good for you and better for the research, because maybe new ways of measuring something have been developed. Maybe with like large longitudinal or multivariate studies that are really, really complicated, there is a more promising set of data that you might want to gather instead of the thing that you got initially approved. Like all of these things become impossible in propositions world, which you can then suggest to say that researchers on their side of the house are stuck with bad proposals that like you can't design the perfect proposal because you don't know about the thing you're trying to study, which is why you're trying to study it in the first place, which then means that you get worse studies on that side of the house. The next thing I think you can establish is that registered reports just like worsen the amount of time wasted during research projects. Like they create two stages of peer review, i.e., first to get the proposal approved, then to submit the data and see whether it aligns with the proposal. Like any peer review takes months because the people doing the reviewing are also academics doing their own thing themselves, which means that they need like months of their time to like research and like read the proposal, the project, the gathered data and come to their conclusions, which means that like researchers have to spend significant amounts of time doing nothing while waiting for these things to get approved. And for research that requires like ethics committee approvals, like for psychology, for example, neither the ethics board nor the peer reviewers will be willing to sign off unless they know that there are no other changes to be made. Because an ethics board won't say yes to a research if the peer reviewers might demand that your methodology changes. So researchers will be stuck trying to please both parties, and this will be an impossible time-consuming game that adds even more time wasted during research in the first place. So the impacts of this, I think, are A, worse research, B, researchers have to waste time, and this reduces the amount of research that could be made in the first place. Lastly, I think is in terms of second argument is in terms of why registered reports worsen the design of research. I think you can say a couple of different things. The first thing you can say is that this worsens the formulation of hypotheses because journals want, even if they have to guarantee publication, journals want to publish results that are promising and true results, i.e., results that prove something as opposed to null findings, because publishing more promising things is how you, as the journal, retains like prestige and the recognition that you have within the scientific field, which means that you are likely to make your peer reviewers pick the original hypotheses that are most likely to lead to promising results. And what this means is that the formulation of hypotheses turns into incremental advances of knowledge as opposed to groundbreaking revelations about the state of knowledge that we have right now. And this is because if we already know that something is true, adding something small to that hypothesis and deviating from it very slightly is likely to lead to a hypothesis that is more true, right? Because you're already operating very, very close to something that we already know to be objectively correct, which means that the chances of your small addition being correct are also probably much higher than the chances of a radical reframing of the knowledge of like psychology, for example. So radical experiments that seek to like change our understanding of a whole field become much less likely to be approved because researchers think that they're less likely to succeed, which is probably very true. But the point is these things never get approved in the first place. So the groundbreaking revelations of science that probably need to happen much less in the world. I think the second thing you can say is that there's like less significant there's going to be less significant amounts of exploratory research being conducted. And what I mean by this is that there are two different types of research. One of which is confirmatory, research, in which you establish a hypothesis and then you try to prove it or disprove it. And there's exploratory research, in which you don't know much about a new emerging field and you just gather as much data about it as you can without you having a specific hypothesis that you want to try to prove or disprove. This kind of research is much less likely to get approved in the first place as well, because researchers don't have a hypothesis or a very strict methodology when they don't know what they want to explore in the first place, which is probably not going to be okay with the peer reviewers, which then means that these things are less likely to get approval, versus in the counterfactual, when the researchers can just do the experiment and then submit the interesting data to the journals, which means that they're more likely to get published in the first place. So I think you can establish that this is important as well, because this kind of exploratory research is the research that enables the creation of better hypotheses and better experiments in the future. And that is what the scientific community is losing when registered reports are much less likely to prioritize these. Finally, in terms of why registered reports are worse for early career researchers, I think the claim you can make is that early career researchers are probably intelligent people, because to do research, you probably need like multiple degrees, but they probably don't have the strongest grasp of methodology because they haven't done a lot of research themselves, which then means that they're much less likely to get approved because their methodology is inferior, even though the ideas might be correct. Either that, or they get approval for a bad methodology that they have no capacity to deviate from, which means that like overall, their first couple of years in research are going to be horrible. Either they have no research or they have very bad research, which all means that they're probably stuck for a very long time as like some other professor's unaccredited and unappreciated intern or like a research assistant, which means that they're more likely to drop out of academia, and that this is a bad thing for like the state of scientific knowledge in general. In terms of strategic evaluations of the argument, again, for the third argument, I give the same thing. If prop doesn't respond, run with this way this. But I do think for opposition, I think both the first and second arguments are feasibly things that you could try to win on. Because with the second argument, you can establish that like the design of research is the prerequisite to all the scientific outcomes in the debate. So even if you win that and that only, you can do plausible weighing as to why this is the most important thing in the round, versus there are perhaps more significant impacts when it comes to like the research outcomes in the first argument as well. And I don't think there's a clever proposition way of outframing the entire first argument, which then means you can win the debate off of that as well. So I think on opposition here, you have slightly more choices in terms of which argument strategically you want to bank on. So really, whichever one proposition engages with less is probably the one that you can weigh the heaviest in like op2 and op3 as well. But yeah, hope this was helpful.